so that you don't starve to death in old age and so forth. Got to have children. In the West, children are an economic burden, so we have fewer of them and we just enjoy our lives. So the replacement rate would be every married couple would have to have 2 children plus a couple, because there's people who just die in car wrecks and never reproduce, and people who are gay and never reproduce and stuff, like people just don't get married. So the replacement rate's like 2.2 per married couple. And Europe is seriously underneath the replacement rate, like at 0.9 I think in Italy it was in the late 90s. I don't know where it is now. But their population growth now is positive in a lot of these countries because of these immigrant groups who are able to make up for all of the negative population growth of the original inhabitants. So they kind of need to bring in new population. They really don't have a lot of choice. Plus they had the money and the wealth, and they felt charitable and altruistic after World War II. They didn't want to be racist and turn people away. So when the trickle started, it turned into a tidal wave. And it's still going today. It's been curtailed in most countries there, but it's still going in the sense that now those communities are there and they're growing. Now he talks about how terrible all this stuff was. Now, as we mentioned earlier, he moved to Europe. He actually moved to Amsterdam first and Oslo later. But he was living there and saw this terribleness for several years. And then September 11th happened. We'll read a bit about what he says here. At around 3:15 Central European Time in the afternoon of September 11th, tell you on page 77, I was writing at my desk in Oslo when I decided I needed to check a fact online. At the Yahoo homepage I noticed a news entry dated only a minute or two earlier. A plane had struck the World Trade Center. I went straight to the TV and switched on CNN. Moments later I saw the second plane strike. For me, as for millions of others, the next few hours were utterly transforming and clarifying. For him they were clarifying. They befuddled a lot of people. But for him, this crystallized everything. He said, wow, is this it? Is this it? Is this what it is? Never had I felt more American. At the same time, I felt a new sense of urgency regarding the need for unity between the 2 continents I called home. Adherents of the extreme Islam that had gained a foothold in urban centers across Western Europe had now attacked my hometown, a metropolis that was the world's preeminent symbol of everything the West stood for and that fundamentalist Muslims despised. I had moved from New York to Europe as if from one world to another, yet 9/11 made me realize I had never left home. For in a larger sense, whether I was in Europe or America didn't matter. Together, America and Europe made up the West, the heartland of democracy, and both were now at war with a common enemy. Now, as I mentioned, America enforced an economic hegemony on the world after World War II. That you were either communist or you were with America. And there weren't a lot of options, and these welfare states spring up in these free nations. And all that's just fine, but the values of freedom, of individualism, of secularism, of individual rights, of order, of the law, ruled Western Europe in a way they had never done before in all of history. Through the feudal system that Germany was in, right up until, and then they start industrializing a bit, and then finally they're united by Bismarck in 1872, and then they start 2 world wars, one after another. These people had never known freedom, and all of a sudden it was given to them and most of Western Europe. It was a golden age. It was a real golden age. I thought that we had brought a sea change to Europe. I thought Europe was changed. I thought, that's done, the old ways are done, there's a new hegemony of Western civilization in Europe. I was wrong. I was as wrong as you could have been in the 1880s when you looked at Europe and said, they're getting better and better all the time. Look, hardly any wars have happened this century. The 1890s, hardly any wars. 1900, 1910, hardly any wars. Europe's great. 1914, the slaughter begins. 1939, a second batch. So they had a half-century breathing spell after World War II. A half-century plus a decade, maybe, or something like that. Not really, because they're not in a state of freedom right now. They're under siege, most of the countries of Western Europe. And their Marxist establishment press won't point it out. Now, he says that on 9/11 and the day after, all across the continent, headlines proclaimed, "We are all American." He says, quote, "Only later would I realize how shallow and contingent those expressions of solidarity were." He says, "Nothing really had changed, yet for some time I believed or hoped otherwise. All right, I thought, now the nonsense will end. After this, Western Europeans will see that we're all in this together. The free world is at war with religious fanatics who despise democracy. Not even the extreme leftists who sympathize with communism can work up empathy for murderous maniacs. But I was wrong as the days went by and as it became clear that America, instead of apologizing or engaging in dialogue or pretending nothing had happened, when it became clear that America was going to react to 9/11 by invading Afghanistan, the response from many quarters of Western Europe was like nothing I had ever seen. It wasn't just a matter of friendly disagreement about how best to respond to a common enemy. It was an increasingly vicious, irrational, twisted howl of America hatred. In Italy, Nobel Prize-winning playwright Dario Fu accused the United States of killing, quote, tens of millions of people with poverty, end quote, every year, and called the mass murders of 9/11 legitimate for this reason. Right? Because we're rich in America, the people dying of poverty in South Africa or Kenya or wherever, it's our fault. In Germany, composer Karl-Heinz Stockhausen described the attack on the World Trade Center as, quote, the greatest work of art imaginable for the whole cosmos. In Britain, the novelist Martin Amis accused America of having, quote, destroyed at least 5% of the Iraqi population, end quote, through UN sanctions. Never mind the fact that Saddam was such a horrible, vicious dictator that we put no-fly zones over the north and south of his country so he couldn't pick on the two populations there. We should have taken Saddam out. Bush Sr. was a jerk for not taking Saddam out when he had the chance. We had to do it later. We should have done it all along. We never should have supported Saddam in the first place in the 1970s. But why not take care of him later when he starts disobeying United Nations and European rules and stuff, NATO agreements and stuff? Why not? Why not take him out? And they're all pissed off about it. It's Saddam's fault. The blood's on Saddam's hands. If anybody died through the UN sanctions, Saddam was the one who made the UN put the sanctions on. He could have administrated his country differently, couldn't he? The American writer Anna Applebaum, who was in London at the time, noted a shift in attitude after no more than 36 hours. On a September 16th column, she described a BBC talk show on which a former U.S. ambassador to Britain, who had lost several colleagues in the attacks, was nearly brought to tears by the brutal anti-American rhetoric of his fellow guests. 36 hours after the attack. Plainly, the Western European establishment, while loath to deal responsibly with real threats, was good at kicking its friends while they were down. Was 9/11 an attack on us all? No, insisted the editors of Swedish newspaper Aftonbladet on September 17th. 6 days? Quote, the terrorists were attacking U.S. imperialism. The U.S. is the greatest mass murderer of our time. Now, I know that America has been up to a lot of mischief in a lot of part of the world, and there's a lot of things we need to do differently. But you can't support anybody else. Alright? The Iranian regime, if they took over America, it would not be pretty. You can't support anybody else. America's got problems. It's got imbeciles running the government, and it's full of idiots There's a lot of religious knuckleheads in America who don't know anything. And unreligious